what I'd like to do is welcome you to this session, Can the World Save the World? Bienvenidos, todos y todas. My name is John Pfeffer. I work with the Institute for Policy Studies in Washington, D.C. I direct Foreign Policy in Focus and the Global Just Transition Project. We have Spanish interpretation, which you can find at the bottom of your screen. Tenemos interpretación en español. And Miriam, our moderator for the panel, will explain a little bit more about the Spanish option. We are delighted to have this session this morning or afternoon or evening, depending on where you are, on the question of global governance and climate change and questions of development. I am going to pass on to Miriam Lang, who is going to be the moderator for our session today. And Miriam is a professor for environmental and sustainability studies at the University of Andina Simón Bolívar in Ecuador, and a member of the Ecosocial Pact of the South, Pacto Ecosocial del Sur. Miriam, thank you very much for moderating our session today, and I'm going to disappear into the cloud now.
Thank you very much, John. Welcome also from my side to this webinar, Can the World Save the World? Bienvenidos, bienvenidas, bienvenides. Si usted requiere de traducción simultánea al español, puede encontrarla en el icono de interpretación, una suerte de símbolo de planeta Tierra que está abajo hacia la derecha en su pantalla. Ahí escoge español y va a tener todo el evento en español. I'm very happy to be able to moderate this panel, this very important topic that we are going to discuss today. I have been asked to moderate this in an active, participating way, and will do my best to do so. I think we all agree that virtually everyone on the planet has by now been affected by some manifestation of climate breakdown, by droughts, fires, superstorms associated with climate change. Many institutions, including the UN, the scientific community, civil society institutions, are working very hard to reduce carbon emissions. And there is also many strategies to shift to clean energy, but nevertheless, we are seeing that emissions continue to rise. Actually, they do so after we have had no less than 27 UN conferences on climate change. But we still can see fossil fuel companies expanding their operations, now even more so in the context of the recent global energy crisis induced by the war between Russia and Ukraine, while at the same time they also invest in greenwashing their image. Every year, we receive new information about how far the commitments UN member states have made regarding the reduction of their emissions differ from what we would really need, according to science, to remain in a safe space, to preserve life on this planet as we know it. We also have enough information about how most states do not implement the necessary policies to even achieve those widely insufficient commitments. It seems somehow that the more we know, the less we are able to take effective action. The same can be said about the accelerated loss of biodiversity. Although it is widely acknowledged that we live in a period of mass extinction of species, which again threatens the balance of complex ecosystems and the continuity of life as we know it, there is little progress at the governance level in spite of many good intentions. Currently, The 15th UN Conference on Biodiversity is taking place in Montreal, and at its beginning, the bitter balance was that at a global level, none of the Aichi biodiversity targets had been met or achieved, according to Elizabeth Maruma Mrema, the Executive Secretary of the CBD, of the Convention on Biodiversity. While some progress was made at the national level in a number of countries, no single country had met all 20 Aichi targets within its own borders, according to an assessment by the UN from September 2020. So the question is this only a problem of lacking political will of some heads of state, as has been stated so many times, or of lacking institutional efficiency? Is it due to incoherence between different UN bodies? And do we even have the right institutions at the global level to address the problems of climate change and other environmental manifestation of crisis? Can the existing institutions, the UN Environmental Programme, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, the Green Climate Fund, the Major Economies Forum on Energy and Climate, the Climate Action Network International, or the UN Convention on Biological Diversity be made more effective? Or do we maybe need a totally different understanding of those institutions and their inherent dynamics to understand what is really going on? Are we caught in an euphemistic picture of what the global community and its stakeholders are and how they relate to each other? These are only some of the aspects we would like to discuss today. And we are proud and happy to present our three panelists that have accepted this invitation. First of all, I would like to introduce Jayati Ghosh. She has taught economics at Jawaharlal Nehru University in New Delhi for many, many years and has been professor of economics at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst in the US since January 2021. In 2021, the United States also named her to be on the high-level advisory board on economic and social affairs, and this year she was appointed by UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres to a new high-level advisory board on effective multilateralism. Her latest publication is The Making of a Catastrophe, the Disastrous Economic Fallout of the COVID-19 Pandemic in India. Jayati, thank you very much for joining this webinar. We are delighted to have you. And I would like to ask you, what is being discussed in this high-level advisory board founded by the UN Secretary General on effective multilateralism? What can you tell us about the diagnosis and about the prospects of reform that are being touched there? Are there proposals for structural reform of the current institutions or of the rules that govern them? Please, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Miriam, and thank you, John, and everyone for inviting me. It's a great pleasure to be part of this panel. Yes, I think Miriam has already laid out, the essential problems right now, and there's no point in repeating those. The high-level advisory board that I'm a member of on effective multilateralism, in a way, the challenge is already in its very title, as you can see, because multilateralism itself is under threat. And of course, part of the reason is because it hasn't been effective, but also the imbalances that are rendering it ineffective are not likely to go away very soon. So I think this is something we're all aware of in the board. And I think we also realize that there's a limit to what individual proposals or proposals even from a particular group can achieve without much broader political will. The diagnosis, well, I don't want to speak for everyone else, so let me give my personal diagnosis of what I see as the problem. I think essentially we are seeing the problems, the challenges to global cooperation, which everybody recognizes is essential if we are to survive as a species on the planet, and if the planet itself is to survive. I think there are really 5 broad isms, if I can call it that, which are preventing any kind of cooperative response. The first is, of course, nationalism, and that's obvious. And it's weird that nationalism has become so dominant when we know that the problems we face today are, by definition, international, whether it's a health pandemic or it is climate change, which, as you have said, everyone in the world is facing in different ways. We know that these are not things that can be regulated within national borders, but nonetheless, governments and people in different countries persist in treating these as ways in which perhaps one nation can survive or benefit even at the expense of another, or can somehow manage despite whatever else is happening in the rest of the world. That's one very major problem. And of course, the fact is that different countries at different levels of development have different needs and different expectations and different requirements, all of which I'm broadly categorizing in the term nationalism. But the second challenge is imperialism. And that I do not mean to refer only to power imbalances between countries. I don't think that is a good definition. For me, imperialism is the struggle of large capital over economic territories when it is supported by their nation states. And we see evidence of that in many of the things that have been described already, whether it is the continued subsidies to fossil fuels, or it is the greenwashing that Miriam mentioned of so-called ESG investments, environmental, social, and governance investments, or a whole range of other aspects. We find that the ability of large capital to sway international policies and national policies in its own interest persists unabated, and that's really a major, major constraint to doing anything serious about climate change. The third big ism that is a problem is short-termism. And we see this particularly in the aftermath of the Ukraine war. I just want to emphasize that the Ukraine war created some supply constraints, but not enough to generate the kinds of inflationary responses we saw. Those were really the result of profiteering by large companies and speculation, which is why prices of food and fuel, for example, are down to pre-war levels, even though nothing has changed in terms of the nature of the war or the supply impact for Russia, Ukraine, and so on. So we must recognize that these forces were created by not necessarily actual physical constraints on supplies, but other factors, stemming from market imperfections and control over markets by large corporations. But that led to immense short-termism on the part of all governments, but including G7 governments in particular, that quickly reversed all of their commitments, whether it is at COP26 or subsequently even at COP27. In fact, they're making less commitments in the latest round. They reversed them because they said, oh my God, we have midterm elections coming, or we have some other thing, or we are worried about what our people will say, and they will end up voting for the far right. So we have to do whatever it takes to increase oil supplies and so on. So that similar short-termism was evident also across the world, and that too has dramatically changed, if you like, the outlook for dealing with climate change. Then we have classism, broadly speaking. And when I say class, I'm referring not just to the problems of economic class, but also of all other kinds of inequality. Because within every country, and globally, of course, we really find that it's the rich, the top 10%, that are responsible for anywhere between 1/3 to more than half of the emissions. Globally, the top 10% are responsible for more than half the emissions, but even within countries, that is the case. And they have the power to influence government policies in ways that ensure that they keep taking the bulk of the carbon budget of the world. And then finally, we have what I could call, for want of a better term, status quoism. But what I really mean by status quoism is the tyranny of the international economic architecture, the legal framework, the regulatory framework, and the global agreements and institutions that to me are actually operating now as constraints to doing anything positive. We really have to reconsider the role played by international financial institutions, by the WTO, by other multilateral development banks, by the legal frameworks encompassed in things like economic partnership agreements, bilateral investment treaties, and so on, because they are also preventing governments from being able to do something about climate change. What does that doing something mean? Very briefly, because I'm taking too long already. Very briefly, doing something for me is in two major areas. At the national level, we have to reverse privatizations. The privatizations of the last 3 decades have been absolutely critical in generating both inequality and more aggressive carbon emissions globally. So we have to reverse the privatization of nature, of land, of the global commons, of services, of amenities, electricity, gas, and utilities, of the use of the cyberspace. All of these are privatizations that need not happen, that we can actually try and control, regulate, and bring back into the public sphere. So that's the first critical change we need. And the second critical change at the international level is to do something about international financial architecture and the global concentration of knowledge and technology. I think these, to me, the way finance operates at the moment and the way in which knowledge is concentrated and is not being allowed to be disseminated in ways that could mitigate and adapt to climate change, to me, these are the biggest barriers to doing something. Let me stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jayati. Yeah, that are really 5 very important points. I am somehow motivated to ask you, so how are the prospects for these proposals that you are making to prosper? But I think I will first introduce our second speaker, and then I will come back to you after listening to Jens Martens. Jens Martens is an economist and political scientist. He has been executive director of Global Policy Forum Europe in Bonn since its foundation in 2004. Since 2016, he has facilitated the publication of an annual report called Spotlight on Sustainable Development, a civil society shadow report on the 2030 Agenda and the SDGs. He has published various articles, books, and studies on sustainable development, our topic of global governments, and UN reform. Jens, very welcome to this virtual discussion space. Thank you for joining today. And I would like to ask you, what are your most important insights about the major shortcomings of the current system of global environmental governments from your civil society perspective?
Thank you, Miriam. Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be here in this important panel together with our other panelists. And I can really follow up on what Jayati said before. It's very complementary what I will say in 5 general messages. My first message is, in order to implement the Paris Agreement and the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, we have to revisit and reshape the hardware of sustainable development. What does it mean? It means that the implementation of the 2030 Agenda is not just a matter of better policies. The current problems of growing inequalities mentioned by Jayati and unsustainable production consumption patterns are deeply connected with power hierarchies, institutions, culture, and policies. Policy reform is necessary, but is not sufficient. Meaningfully tackling the obstacles and contradictions in the implementation of the 2030 Agenda requires more holistic and more sweeping shifts in how and where power is vested, including through institutional reforms. In other words, a simple software update of policies is not enough. We have to revisit and reshape the hardware of sustainable development. That means governments and institutions at all levels. But that brings me to my second message. Revisiting the hardware of sustainable development has to start at the local and national level. We have to strengthen bottom-up governance. While most of governance discourse emphasizes the democratic deficits, gaps, and fragmentation in global governance, the major challenge, in my view, for more effective governance at the global level is the lack of coherence at the national level. The attempt to create more effective global institutions does not work if it's not reflected in effective national counterparts. For instance, as long as environmental ministries are weak at the national level, we cannot expect the United Environment Programme, UNEP, to be strong at the global level. Therefore, it's necessary to strengthen bottom-up governance. But bottom-up governance refers not only to the direction of influence from the local to the global, it also calls for more governance space to be retained at the local and national level. More and more local governments in their communities are actively taking up the challenge to address climate change and to meet the SDGs. But to do so, they need really adequate resources, they need authority, and they need institutional capacity. And often, local and national policy space is limited by external interventions. The IMF plays a central role in this regard, the International Monetary Fund. Its neoliberal approach has proven incompatible with the achievement of the SDGs and the climate goals. In many countries, IMF recommendations and loan conditionalities have led to deepening of social and economic inequalities and threats to human rights. And our colleague Isabel Ortiz and others have published excellent studies on the various austerity measures imposed by the IMF and possible alternatives. Achieving the SDGs, including the climate goals, will not happen without an enabling environment at an international level, but what we often see is a disabling environment that makes it difficult to raise the urgently needed domestic resources. This brings me to my third message, policy coherence. Policy coherence for sustainable development will not be possible without overcoming governance incoherences. In the 2030 agenda, governments committed to enhancing policy coherence for sustainable development and to respect each country's policy space. But this is constantly undermined by the asymmetric nature of the global governance system with the IMF and the World Bank dominating discourse and policies. While the IMF and the World Bank and the WTO and various organizations of club governance like the OECD have financial resources and regulatory instruments to influence policies and laws, the UN has successfully been kept out of their business over decades. One striking example is the asymmetry between human and environmental rights and investor rights, for instance, in the context of the investor-state dispute settlement system. It awards foreign investors the right to sue governments for compensation if government policies, for instance, environmental policies, reduce profits. And this system undermines the ability of governments, for instance, to take policy decisions and enforce measures towards stronger domestic regulation, for instance, of fossil fuel industries or the phasing out of fossil fuel energy systems. Therefore, removing the ability of investors to sue states in the ISDS system would be an important step in reducing the asymmetry in global governance. But, and that's my fourth message, enhancing governance coherence also means that we have to strengthen the relevant UN bodies, particularly the high-level political forum of the United Nations. The 2030 agenda, in the 2030 agenda, the governments decided that the high-level political forum should play an important role in follow-up and review of the Sustainable Development Goals. But compared to other policy arenas, such as the Security Council or the Human Rights Council, the HLPF remained extremely weak. It meets only 8 days per year. It has a small budget and no decision-making power. The HLPF must be strengthened similarly to the direction taken by the member states for the Human Rights Council in 2005, when the Human Rights Commission was upgraded to a Human Rights Council. What we need is a Sustainable Development Council supported by complementary machinery at regional and thematic levels. But upgrading the HLPF is not enough. Enhancing governance coherence also requires filling global governance gaps in areas that are still dominated by exclusive clubs like the OECD or the Paris Club on debt policy. The two recommendations that are most cited in this context are first the establishment of an intergovernmental tax body under the auspices of the United Nations, which shall ensure that all UN member states, and not only the rich, can participate equally in the reform of global tax rules. And second, the creation of a debt workout mechanism or a debt workout institution within the UN system, independent of creditors and debtors, to facilitate debt restructuring processes. And my last, fifth and final message is that all these activities related to democratic governance or the democratization of governance require democratic and sufficient funding. Adequate funding at all levels is a fundamental prerequisite to improve climate governance and SDG implementation. At the global level, this requires the provision of predictable and reliable funding to the UN system. Let me mention that the total assessed contributions to the UN regular budget in 2022 were just about $3 billion. For comparison, the New York City budget alone is over $100 billion. Total financial contributions to all funds, programs, and specialized agencies with regard to development activities of the UN amount to around 40 billion, but far more than 50% of these are project-tied non-core resources, mainly earmarked to favor individual donor priorities. That means mainly priorities of the rich donors. Governments should reverse this trend towards voluntary non-core earmarked contributions, as well as the increasing reliance on philanthropic funding and multi-stakeholder partnerships. Democratic governance requires democratic funding instead of unpredictable support from private foundations like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation that reduce the flexibility and autonomy of the organization, of all UN organizations. This is particularly relevant for the WHO, the World Health Organization, but will also be relevant, for instance, for the new funding arrangements for responding to loss and damage associated with climate change, which were just not established, but decided at the last COP in Egypt this year. Simply put, a successful global response to the climate crisis is impossible if we do not close the climate finance gap with new and additional public money, and multi-stakeholder arrangements are not the right answer to this challenge. And I'm sure that Madhuresh Kumar will further explain what I mean, and I can, I think, directly hand over to Madhuresh because he is an expert, particularly on the multi-stakeholderism issue. So thank you for the moment, and I hand over to Madhuresh.
Thank you very much, Jens. Yes, in fact, your last point leads us directly to Madhuresh Kumar's expertise. A warm welcome also to you. Madhuresh Kumar is an Indian activist researcher who is currently based in Paris. He is a senior fellow at Atlantic Institute and a resistance studies fellow at the University of Massachusetts in Amherst. Earlier, he was a national convener of the National Alliance of People's Movements in India for nearly a decade. And he has co-authored, was what interests us here, the publication, The Great Takeover, Mapping of Multi-Stakeholderism in Global Governance, which was published by the Transnational Institute at the end of 2021, together with Marianne Manahan from the Philippines. He also is a member of the Global Working Group Beyond Development, by the way. Madhuresh, thank you very much for being here, and we are already now very eager to hear what you have to say about that rather complicated term, which is multi-stakeholderism. What does that even mean, and what consequences does it have for the effectiveness of global environmental and climate governance?
Thank you, Miriam, and very happy to join this distinguished panel and with people whose work I have admired quite a lot. and in a way have grown up reading, and especially Jayati is coming from India. I have learned a lot from, and her views and articles and writings have shaped a lot of many of our friends and as well as mine. I'll just to start by saying that I was at COP in Sharm el-Sheikh last month, and this was my first COP. And what welcomed us was a banner at the airport which said, I'm just reading the banner, then it said that the welcome to COP27, main partners are Vodafone, Microsoft, Boston Consulting Group, and then there are a couple of others, and then partners were IBM, Siemens, supporters were Cisco, Coca-Cola, SODIC, Google, Bank of America, and a couple of other corporate houses. The reason I'm reading this is the UNFCCC, the main body, and what James just said, that most of the UN institutions are faced with growing monetary problem. But it's not the monetary problem which is actually at the crux of the issue. I think we are aware of the fact that multilateralism is under great threat. And it's threat because of reasons which both the speakers have mentioned. But the way it has shaped the solution which has been proposed to the world and which has evolved over a period of time in last 3-4 decades is multi-stakeholderism. And last year, the book which Miriam mentioned, Marianne and I, we spent a year almost studying how does the multi-stakeholderism has evolved in 5 key sectors: education, health, environment, agriculture, and internet and communications. And what we found is astonishing. In many of the things we know, but we already know that how corporations have captured the institutions, philanthropies have taken space into global governance, as well as the big bingos, the big international NGOs and others. We already know some of these issues, some of these propositions, but it is interesting the way they actually have made a space for themselves in the global governance agenda, and the amount of influence they have compared to the democratically elected governments mainly from the global south. We can have a separate debate about it, about the nature of the state and the nature of election and the nature of democracy in these countries. But I think that's beyond the point. As long as they're all members of UN, where one country, one vote principle applies, I think the question remains is that can multi-stakeholderism really replace the multilateral agenda? And that is at the heart of it, in my mind. For this particular topic, what we did was that we looked at multi-stakeholder initiatives or institutions or processes which have taken shape post 2000, so in this century, 21st century. And we were very selective, so it's not, we have not gone and looked at every other agreement which has been bilateral, multilateral agreement. But what we did was we looked at the MSI, we had a definition which we used, and that definition led us to selecting some 26 MSI initiatives in these 2 decades. And what we found is that there are 3 main sectors have been at the heart of it. One was the forest, extractives, and renewable sector. There were 20, so we looked at 26 multi-stakeholder initiatives, of which forests occupied roughly 27%, extractives 23%, renewable energy 23%. So these were the MSIs which were dealing with these subjects. And when we say MSIs, then what kind of MSIs we are talking? I'll just name a few that will give you an idea of what we looked at, like Initiative for Responsible Mining Assurance, Hydropower Sustainability Assessment Protocol, Development Diamond Initiative, or Tropical Forest Alliance, Natural Capital Solutions Alliance, Global Commons Alliance, Forest for Life Partnership, and there were many others like Better Biomass, Alliance for Responsible Mining, Fairstone, Initiative for Responsible Mining Assurance, Roundtable on Sustainable Biomaterials, Tropical Forest Alliance, then Nature for Climate, Natural Climate Solution Alliance, and Capital Coalition, several others which we looked at. And what we found is that in the first decade, has been spent primarily establishing the problem and saying that the multilateral institutions are failing, and that's why we need solutions. And there is a big bump around 2006 when we see 4 of the multi-stakeholder initiatives coming in at that time, and they were primarily looking at the extractive industry. So in a way, because as the global demand and the global production was growing of the consumable goods, there was a need, rallying cry for regulating some of these industries. So that we find that the Initiative for Responsible Mining Assurance, MSI, comes at that time, Fairstone or Development Diamond Initiative, and some of those came in 2006. As we move into this decade, which is 2011 to 2020, what we realize is that the whole thing takes a very different turn. And this is building on what happened in the Rio Plus 20. That the Rio Plus 20 in a way lays down the foundation for green economy. And there is a complete acceptance that the next decade is going to be the decade of the green economy. And from that comes a host of other MSIs, which are primarily aimed at promoting nature-based solutions. Because the green economy, the heart of it is that if you can, and I'll read it, that it is all about getting the price right. If nature does not have a price, human beings are not incentivized to take care of it. And that's at the heart of the nature-based solutions, at the heart of the climate solutions, or the many of the false solutions which we talk about. And this is something which has come and which has been promoted by these MSIs. So what they did was, so say, for example, Nature for Climate, or the Natural Coalition for Natural Climate Solution Alliance. They all promoted they promoted solutions like, and the very innovative in terms of the words they use. So for example, nature positive future. What is nature positive future? Basically, the idea is that we have to use as much nature and also replace it. Basically, if you, a very easy thing which we see is the carbon offset. The carbon offsets actually are coming out of that principle, that you can continue to produce as much carbon as you can, as long as you also plant some forest somewhere else. So wherever the emissions are happening, you may not take any action there, but as long as you do plantation elsewhere, that is something which is going to make you give you carbon offset. And that way the industries benefit from that program. And this is what is happening even in the, and there are twists given to like nature future solutions. So you use words which actually make you believe that we are taking action, we are making progress. But what they do actually do these things, what they do is they are actually shifting the agenda. Rather than talking about emission reductions and taking hardcore actions whereby there is actual, there are targets met towards reaching the 1.5 degree goal, which has been set by the Paris Agreement. Rather than we spend a lot of time talking about what will be the carbon-based solution, what will be the nature-based solution, the 30-30 agenda, which occupies a lot of time in discussion at the UN. And then there are techno fixes which keeps coming. And the techno fixes, when I say there is like at this COP, there were a number of pavilions, and the two big themes which dominated the COP this time was the carbon capture CCUS, carbon capture, and that's the floodgate which has been opened about the carbon capture. And the second is around the hydrogen hype, that the hydrogen and the carbon capture, they are going in some ways to fix the problems, and they are the big solutions which we are looking at. So that is something which has come in, and these in a way divert a lot of attention what we are talking about in terms of climate justice, the agenda of climate justice, when everybody talks about, because this mixes the social justice. We are aware of the fact that the whatever we start with the techno fixes, they are not going to solve the problem. And these techno fixes in a way take in the form of geoengineering, ocean engineering, and a number of other forms which are manifesting themselves. This is not limited to, unfortunately, the climate. problem, because climate is the big envelope in which we are talking. But it is having an impact on indigenous communities, because a lot of the afforestation program, most of it is generally monoculture. So 1 trillion tree initiative, which is backed by the UN, that's also something having promoting monoculture, and on the ground it leads to destruction of the biodiversity, destruction of the eviction of the indigenous communities, and many others. So their manifestation of these on the ground are a lot. However, the voices of these organizations, when it comes to the multi-stakeholder initiatives, they are not respected, or neither are present there. The two big, couple of NGOs who do occupy and have central role within the MSIs are Worldwide Fund for Nature, WRI, then Nature Conservancy, Conservation International, and then few others. There are some big foundations, philanthropies, who also occupy big space in this, like the Bloomberg Philanthropies is there as one of the main sponsors for this COP. But then there is Ford Foundation, then the Betty and Moore Foundation, and there are several others who have invested a lot of money into the MSIs over a period of time, and the Climate Works Foundation as well. Lastly, I would say that it's not that the corporate capture or the philanthropic capture or the conservation NGOs have taken over the agenda on their own. The UN has been a willing participant in it. The UN institutions, they have allowed themselves to actually make it available for them. And at times, like sustainable energy for all, that's another MSI which we studied. Ban Ki-moon, the former UN General Secretary, he set it up in 2011 as a response to something which was coming up in 2012. There was a statement which was made by the group of countries had made that pledge. So to make that effective, Ban Ki-moon set this up. But later on, the sustainable energy for all acquires an independent status of its own, on which UN has no control, the decisions of which are not negotiated or debated inside the UN General Assembly, but it does have an important role to play in shaping the agenda of the sustainable energy, in setting the standards, in developing policy formulations and all of that. So there are impacts which happens, but they become outside the UN domain, even though they are created by the UN. Similarly, Renewable Energy and Energy Efficiency Partnership, that was backed by the UNIDO, but then later on it becomes on its own, and they become unaccountable. So completely go into the lap of the corporations and others who shape up the agenda. However, they do have influence on that. Very lastly, I'll take one last sentence, that I think the World Economic Forum, and this is, we cannot mention multi-stakeholderism and not take the name of World Economic Forum. World Economic Forum and World Council of Sustainable Business Development. These are the two bodies which have actually shaped a lot of the agenda when it comes to environment, education, health, internet and governance, and many others. So they have a crucial role, and many a times we will find, if we read their documents, what they produce for the future roadmap, we will find them being reciprocated or reproduced in the many of the UN MSIs. So there is a close link between all of them processes. So there is a big takeover which has happened. So while we may argue and continue to hold multilateral institutions and our own national governments accountable, but we must realize that decision making is happening somewhere else. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Madhuresh. My impression after listening to you and also to Jens and to some extent to Jayati is that we are moving towards some sort of environmental plutocracy worldwide instead of having democratic decision-making where human societies could decide about their future and their resilience in the face of climate change, their options. So this is really worrying. I would like first to dive into one topic that has been addressed by Jayati in rather very graphic terms. You spoke of the tyranny of the international economic architecture, and also Jens spoke about the asymmetric architecture of international financial institutions and of an exclusive club governance. I would like to add to that, just spelling out a little bit how these asymmetries work, for example, in the World Bank and in the International Monetary Fund, two key institutions that govern global economic policy and are deeply undemocratic. I found an article by the British anthropological economist Jason Hickel, who says they are openly favoring the interests of the USA and Europe, not only regarding the assignments of their directors, which are always from these regions, but also because voting power in these institutions is heavily skewed in favor of rich countries. He says the US has de facto veto power over all significant decisions, and together with the rest of the G7 and the European Union, it controls well over half of the votes in both of these agencies, while middle and low income countries, which together would constitute 85% of the world's population, have a minority share only. So I would like to read a quote from an article from 2021 by Jason Hickel. He says, if we look at voting allocations in per capita terms, the inequalities are truly extreme. For every vote the average person in the global north has, the average person in the global south has only 1/8 of a vote. And the average South Asian, for example, only 1/20. Not only is there minority control over global economic policy making, there is also a clear racial imbalance at play. On average, the votes of people of color are worth only a fraction of their counterparts. If this was the case in any particular country, we would be outraged. We would call it apartheid. Yet a form of apartheid operates right at the heart of international economic governance today and has come to be accepted as normal. So those are the institutions who have imposed the devastating structural adjustment measures on the global south, which have also in a second effect weakened environmental regulations and make it often impossible to meet the SDGs for those countries. So I would like to ask you, Jayati, and you, Jens, what do you think could be done really about these asymmetries? Is there any chance that the club governance could be reverted today, and that also this shift toward private funding, non-democratic funding, funding which depends on the goodwill of some billionaire, could be reverted into public funding, which has transparent ways of decision-making added? Jayati.
Yeah, thank you very much. Two quite different questions. You know, with regard to the international financial institutions, developing countries have been asking for a very long time for a revision of the quotas and the voting shares in the IMF and the World Bank. And this is for many reasons. Of course, the population part that Jason Hickel has mentioned is certainly relevant and important. But even in terms of the basic criteria for along which voting rights were originally allocated, it was on the basis of your share of the global economy and of global trade. This was done, as you know, based on data of the 1940s. And the world has changed dramatically since then. And developing countries have significantly increased their share of both. And certain countries in particular are much more significant, while a number of European countries are much less significant. So this demand for a significant change in the voting rights and in the quota shares is a very long-standing demand. We got a very minor change in, I think it was about 10 years ago, which didn't really make very much of a change. It meant that the US and the European Union together retain the majority of the votes and the ability to influence both of these institutions. The leadership, of course, is an issue. But it's not only the leadership. The leadership issue is a problem because it's a so-called gentleman's agreement between the US and Europe that one of them will run the fund and the other one will run the bank. But even more than that, I would argue, it is that as a result of this, for example, when you have a new issue of SDRs, special drawing rights, the liquidity created by the IMF, which we just had an issue in 2021 for $650 billion, is distributed according to quota, which really means that they don't get very much. The developing world gets very little. 80% of this money goes to countries that are never going to use these SDRs. So it's an inefficient way of increasing global liquidity. And it certainly is counter to the idea that, let's say, Keynes had when he proposed the International Clearing Union, where developing countries would get double of their shares of the quotas and so on. So yes, that is absolutely an issue. The question is, how do you change this? Now, obviously, the rich countries that control these institutions are not going to give it up easily. And every attempt to change has been blocked precisely by them because they have the voting rights. Now, do you say, okay, let's demolish the whole thing and start afresh? Because how do you create a new institution? How do you even create a minimally democratic way of functioning? And here is another dilemma, which I think is at the heart of it and which also stems from the global power imbalance. The institutions that do have a much more democratic kind of functioning with every country one vote and so on, let's say the WHO, are completely underfunded. And this is something that was mentioned also by Jens. The minute rich countries feel they cannot determine it, they don't fund it. That's the tragic and unfortunate case. I think, unfortunately, we will not get a major shift in these institutions until we get a major shift in the position of the rich countries who are currently in control. And we will not get that shift unless the people in these countries make a noise about it. I have to confess, I am quite not distressed, but I'm not even surprised, but I'm saddened by the lack of public outcry, concern, mobilization along greater democratization of these institutions. I'm currently teaching in the US. Most people in the United States, even in the Northeast, very progressive state of Massachusetts where I'm teaching, couldn't be bothered with this. And similarly in Europe, they don't really care. So I think that's a problem. I think it's more important for people's movements in the North to be much more actively pointing out how this is against not just the interests of the developing world, but it's against the enlightened self-interest of people in the rich countries as well. You had a second question, which is slightly different. So I will stop here in case Jens and Madhuresh want to add to this point.
Thank you. Go ahead, Jens.
Well, I cannot add a lot because I really completely agree with what Jayati said before. I mean, we were promoting a change in the voting procedures of the IMF and the World Bank for the past 20 years or so, starting in the Monterey Conference 2002 or even earlier. And we always said, instead of one country, one vote, we have this $1, one vote system, which we abolished at the national level in Germany, for instance, in the 19th century, and we still have it at the global level. This is really not the way to go. It's really not democratic, and we have to change this. We talk to our government about it, and we have to continue to talk to them about it and have to try to change it. The same with regard to the funding. I said that what the global institutions get in public funding is really minimal. I mentioned the $3 billion for the UN in contrast to the $100 billion only for the city of New York. And for instance, UNEP gets 25 million, not billion, 25 million from the regular budget per year, which is really ridiculous. And even if you put everything together, all earmarked funds and the Environment Fund and so on, UNEP has less than 500 million per year and has to solve all the environmental problems in the world with these 500 millions. That's, again, that's ridiculous. And the only we can do is really to talk to our governments about this and try to convince them to change it. because
Madhuresh.
as we said in the just 2 weeks ago, there was this big conference in Santiago de Chile. Our future is public. Maybe some of you were there or participated online. Jayati spoke there. And what's really important for the national level, our future is public, is also important for the global level. So public funding for global institutions is essential. And that's why so many secretariats were desperately seeking for alternative funding and went to these philanthropic foundations to get money, because they simply didn't have enough from public sources. So we have to blame, in this regard, we have to blame mainly our national governments in the north, and less, I think, the philanthropic foundations to provide resources. We can blame them for other reasons, for their concepts and for their kind of influence they have. But with regard to the funding, we really have to blame our own governments in the north.
Okay, it just came to my mind that if the super rich were paying more taxes, there would be less philanthropic money going around and more public money.
Yeah,
so
exactly.
That might be a suggestion.
Yes, exactly. And that's why we also criticize the lobbying, not only of the super rich, but also of the transnational corporations to reduce tax rates. And I mean, this is also part of the game, and we have to address this. That's why I talked before about the need to really have tax justice at the global level, with not only the rich countries again be involved in setting the tax rules, but also all governments, particularly from the global south.
Madhuresh, I would like to ask you now, not in your role as author of this book, but as ex-coordinator of Indian social movements. Jens is speaking of we have to keep talking to our governments as one strategy. How would you assess the role of social movements in maybe influencing in the past to some extent the range of authority that the IMF and the World Bank have had? Have they played any significant role?
Yeah, in fact, I was tempted to say something about it. So thanks for asking this, because when Jayati was mentioning that where she's teaching today and how there is a great apathy in the global north, but I think this we are witnessing all around, because this, remember the days of the 1999 Battle of Seattle onwards, and the whole World Social Forum took up, and that the heydays of the anti-World Bank and the IMF protests, when I think you all had a greater role to play there. And I think those were the heydays, really. And I think now we have seen, I think this decade is more dominated by the rise of authoritarianism as a result, and the Trumps of the world, and Trump, Modi, and Bolsonaro, they have actually dominated the scene. As a result, I think a lot of our energy goes into just fighting the right-wing authoritarianism or the rise of the right wing. So somewhere there is, in a way, I think it's not that the concerns are not there, because some of those actors still are around. But however, I do feel that somewhere there is a collective challenge in front of the social movements of the world, actually, to be able to not only fight and win the battle of against the right wing, but also against the right wing economics, because those forces have actually become much more influential, but also they have become much more mainstream. In fact, today having a big industry representative in any of the multilateral forums, or even multi-stakeholder initiatives, or even bodies, they are seen as equal. And if you can, and even the media and everybody can talk and say that, yeah, you need to talk to industry. You can't do anything without the industry. So somewhere they have, in a way, established their political legitimacy, something which I think in the last decade or the last decade of the 20th century, we had managed to actually make them villains, but today they are not seen as the villains. And that's the unfortunate part, that our governments in the global north as well as the south have opened the door and given them that platform. So and I think there's something on related to who are the people who today are the champions in the renewable energy. And I think that is something to look at, because in India, Adani or the Reliance, they are also the leaders. They are the fossil giants, but they're also leaders in the renewable energy. Same in the globally, BP, Shell, and many others. They all have invested so much into it. They have diversified. And there is a blind spot which is emerging somewhere, that in the global climate movement, I would say, I'm not talking about, I make a distinction between global climate movement and global climate justice movement. In the global climate movement, there is a somewhere muted celebration of the fact that if we are able to shift these corporations to giving more renewable energy at a scale, then we will have solved the problem. And I think by taking that stand, I don't think we'll be able to shift the power imbalance, which we all have been talking about, the inequality in the global governance system or in the financial architecture or anywhere. So ultimately, I think we have to tilt the power balance, and that's what the grassroots movements or more radical trade unions and others have a task at hand. This is something which we have to do. It's not, there are efforts being made, but perhaps we have to wait for a big tide and upsurge, which will make it much more visible. I remain hopeful. Thank you.
Thank you. Before coming back to my first question, the second question from before with you, Jayati, I would like to give voice to a written comment in the chat by one of our attendants. I will read it in English. It is originally there in Spanish. Hello, I am Luis Nenkimo, a young leader of the indigenous Waorani nationality in Ecuador. Thank you for this webinar. According to my opinion, the COP is a big business for the big multinational corporations, which, just make their business in this event, but this will not bring any solution to global climate change. I would propose alternatives from the indigenous people of the Amazon in Ecuador, a voice toward the world from the national level to those big corporations that they should not finance in that way. Those corporations which destroy our Amazon, which for us peoples and nationalities is our home, where we live and where we have everything. We have our natural medicine, our market, clean water, pure air, and everything is healthy, which the extractivist corporations come to destroy our house, which is nature in the Amazon. So thank you, Luis, for this comment. I will read out other comments later, and I would like to invite you at this moment to also post your questions in the chat so that we can give them space in our discussion here. Jayati, you mentioned that the quota system is from the 40s and that it's really not up to date. I would agree with that. And more generally speaking, we are we are talking about an institutional system that has been created in a very specific historical moment after World War II, right? Where the world faced a specific set of problems. One, of course, the major one was the just finishing World War and all the deaths it had provoked. Also, there were many anti-colonial struggles, and there are many people who say that the multilateral system until the early 70s was much more equitable in a north-south dimension. We all even had the developing countries asking for a new economic international order at that point, and then there came a sort of shift, which coincides in time with neoliberal globalization of the economy, where there was a very strong, coordinated, discursive attack on states and their inefficacy in governance, precisely. And then the wave of privatizations kicked in, which allowed private capital to strive, while citizens' saying in public policy shrunk. This is how I would put that in very concise terms. So now with the multi-stakeholder culture in the UN, maybe could we say that something similar is happening in the UN institutions, like they are being accused of being inefficient, and this is why now private actors are coming to the table and will ultimately define the fate of the world? With this institutional system, of course, allowing them to do so and creating the rules that are necessary for them to take all that space. So it would be very few, very big corporations and super rich people who have the decisions in their hands. What is this being discussed in the high-level commission you are part of, and in which terms? And do you see any hope that this could be reverted and that we even could get back maybe to the level of the early 70s, where things were looking different?
Well, I would not romanticize the earlier period so much. The reason we had demands for a new international economic order is precisely because developing countries felt that it was not just and equitable. So yes, it was a period of great stability, and it was a period of, relative, in retrospect, relatively more access to certain institutions. But some of the imbalances that we're talking about, whether in trade or in finance or in technology, existed even then. So let's not sort of say that it was all wonderful in the 50s, 60s until the early 70s and that, it's just deteriorated since then. I'm not quite sure that that is how I would put it. It is absolutely true that neoliberal financial globalization has dramatically further worsened the conditions and the terms of operation globally. But I would put it more in terms of the supremacy of large capital over everyone else. It's certainly true that, G7 and so on, that, express the interests of their large capital, and that is often counterposed to the interests of the states in developing countries. But overall, there is an overarching, shall we say, support by states to large capital within their own countries, across the world. I think the comment from Ecuador also showed that, and globally. So that is what I call imperialism. To me, it's not just, a question of one country against another. In fact, I don't think it is. I think one of the tragedies today is that people don't see it that way, and people see it in purely national terms, and people, even in the richer countries, don't recognize that so much of what is happening, even in terms of, say, intellectual property regimes, is against their own interests. And so that, I think, is one of the big sort of cons of the current system that they have got away with, that they have been able to alter. Are these discussions ongoing in this advisory board? Absolutely, yes. Are we all on the same page on this? No, because the people from very different backgrounds, representing different interests. That's the reason why I think we were all put together. Even if we were all on the same page, how much impact would it have? And I think here we have to have a little bit of a reality check on what commissions and advisory boards can achieve. We can advise, we can say this is what we think should happen. This is how we believe the international financial architecture must be changed. And we can put it out there. That's all we can do. There is nothing more we can do. Everything else really depends on political will. And I keep repeating this, political will is not just suddenly governments seeing the light and becoming good. Political will is when governments are forced to respond by their own popular response, by the people. And until that happens, we're not going to get a change. No matter how many high-level boards and commissions come up with excellent recommendations that we can all agree with, we will not get a change. In terms of the global financial architecture, after the global financial crisis, there was an excellent commission created by the UN General Assembly, headed by Joseph Stiglitz, and it came up with some really fine recommendations, which to me are still valid, still relevant. They were not implemented. They were not even considered. The IFIs, I don't even know if anyone has bothered to read that whole report. So, just having good intentions and coming up with things that can be done, I think all of us can come up with many things that can and should be done. In terms of answering the question that is the top of this webinar, can the world save the world? Yes, the world can save the world. Will the world save the world? No, not at the current rate, and not unless people actually rise up and make sure that their governments act. So it's not really about being on a board and making good proposals, I think. It's much more about generating the popular responses.
I would try to put a question out which maybe feels also pessimistic or not so well. The Second World War generated a sort of foundational moment where world societies and world leaders were so shaken that they sat down not only to generate the UN system, but also the Declaration of Human Rights and so on. What level of catastrophe do you think we need, and what level of suffering and death today to create a refoundational moment as we are stating we would need here? Is there any chance that this happens still on time? That could be for Jens or for you, Jayati. I don't know. It's something that moves me sometimes when I talk to my students and they get so helpless about all the things in the capitalist world system going on. And then someone might say, okay, the pace of disaster will mark the pace of change, but it might be too late.
Well, I'm going to let Jens answer that first. It's a very big question.
Let me mention maybe a very small example, but it fits a bit into this discussion. When the World Health Organization negotiated the tobacco control convention, they decided to exclude lobbyists from the tobacco companies to be part of this negotiation. And then in the end, they really came out and agreed to a quite strong tobacco control convention, which is now in place. And I'm wondering why this is not possible with regard to the negotiations in the climate sphere, and why it's not possible to convince our governments that fossil fuel lobbyists, for instance, and I think Madhuresh saw a lot when he was at the COP, that they are excluded, because there's a conflict of interest, and it's not acceptable that those who are really working against progress are part of the discussion. So, and
a very obvious conflict of interest, yes.
Yes, and I think we had precedents that this was done by governments in other arenas, and I think it could be done when we really try to put pressure on our governments to do it and make it really public that hundreds of lobbyists were present in Sharm el-Sheikh and really helped to avoid more progress in this field. So I think it's in the end it's all about power, stupid. So we have to really shape the power in the discourse, and I'm not so pessimistic as you may be, Miriam, because I see a lot of social movements occurring in the last couple of even years as a kind of counter-reaction to nationalism, counter-reaction to the inactivities of our governments. Name it Friday for Future or Extinction Rebellion or Black Lives Matter or whatever. We see movements popping up all over the world, and that's very, very necessary to put pressure on our governments, because they only respond to pressure from below. And I think that's something we have to continue, and we will then see if we can make progress.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think also, though, we also have to develop strategies to put pressure on plutocrats somehow, and not only on governments, because there is this power imbalance. I
wouldn't put pressure on plutocrats. I would just change the tax system so that we don't have these super wealthy people in the world.
That's
so I mean, that's we have a tax system which is with the highest tax rates much below what we had in the 1970s or even 1980s.
Yeah.
And I mean, that's simply something which is not acceptable, and that's what we have to really tell our governments at all levels, particularly in the US and in European countries. And that's what we do with the tax justice movement. I mean, that it's not done, and Jayati could say much more about this, to have a kind of minimum tax of 15% for transnational corporations. I mean, this is maybe a very, very minor first step at the global level, but we have to do much more.
Yeah, right. I would like to address two topics in the time we have left. Madhuresh, this is a question directed to whoever of you wants to answer it, but I would like to take one of your quotes. Madhuresh, you were saying it's all a question of price at the COP when you were just sharing your experience of being in Sharm el-Sheikh. And we can observe that actually commodification of nature is coming forward ever more aggressively. Like the only strategy to protect nature is putting a price on nature. And all the solutions that are being discussed somehow are expected to be lucrative solutions, to give return on capital. Yeah. So I would like to say here in Latin America, there are many people who speak of a civilizational crisis, in fact, much more than an only climate or environmental crisis. And they point at some ontological and epistemological assumptions that are at the basis of how we look at the problems and how we frame the possible solutions. And this would be that the human being is a possessive individual, for example, which always wants to compete individualistically against others and is not depending on coexistence, interdependencies, and collaboration, but also that technology and modern science will bring us salvation. And on the other hand, we know that indigenous peoples are responsible for preserving 80% of the biodiversity that still exists today. And this is not some marginal or subaltern information. This is even confirmed by the World Bank. So, but nevertheless, we somehow do everything to disrespect, weaken, and threaten indigenous peoples' modes of living instead of strengthening them and guaranteeing their material basis, and here I would like to stress their material basis in their own terms. We still systematically treat indigenous peoples as poor and in need of development. We are reluctant to guarantee their land rights, their rights to clean water, free seeds, for example, their rights to the forest they have coexisted with, and instead we propose paying them money to compensate their losses, which is just another way of weakening their own forms of social organization, of decision-making, and of inhabiting the world, as it causes division and lures them into consumerism, individualism, and entrepreneurship. Precisely those aspects of capitalist subjectivity that have brought about the current environmental breakdown, I would say. So, in order to become more effective in environmental governance, we tend to adopt more and more the logics of financial capital. climate adaptation can only be paid for if there is a significant return on capital, for example, or climate finance is given out in loans in a significant proportion, contributing to even deepen the sovereign debt of countries of the global south, instead of engaging in a logic that would put colonial and environmental debt at the forefront. So I think there is a problem of underlying logics and understandings and framings of the problem in global environmental governance. That might be provocative, but I would like to ask you about your views on that. Whoever wants to go first. Yes.
I can just say one thing. I think David Harvey's idea of accumulation by dispossession. And so that was one idea the neoliberal capital took root. But now I think we have gone past that stage because what is at hand is that they are saying that the nature itself is the capital. And I think that's the thinking which is driving a lot of the multi-stakeholder initiatives which we saw in this decade. And what this thinking is doing, that it sees that the solution to this web of crisis is creation of new markets, because this is embedded in the whole idea that the market-led solution, so the market can solve the problem. And I think that has led to creation of more markets, and which goes beyond the existing market the way we understand and see as. So they're like ecosystems marketplace. There's a carbon market where cap and trade, RED plus, clean development mechanism. There is natural capital protocol. And then there is, how will these markets be governed? That's something which the UN platform and is being used today to develop standards, to develop governance models for such markets. And in this market, what it is doing is that it's completely transforming the relationship, the social relationship, especially the human and the nature relationship. There's no place for it. So the financialization of nature, earlier when it was visible, now it has gone somewhere in cloud. We don't even understand what it is, what does it lead to. And as a result, I think the debates which we are having at the indigenous community level or at the social movements level find no mention actually that it's like they are happening in two separate universes. There is no linkage to it. Like, for example, the price they have put on the nature is that there is roughly, there are 17 ecosystem services. So there is this whole concept of payment for ecosystem services, which has come in. So there are 17 ecosystem services which has been identified and 16 biomes. And together, there is an estimate, the 16 to 54 trillion if can be unlocked from this. And the idea is that this money will then be put to solving some of the biggest climate crisis. Now, we all know that when the money gets generated, a lot of money is somewhere up in the air, and we don't get to see that money. And ultimately, what rolls out on the ground, we see is not going to be helpful for our communities. So I can only say that this whole trend, and it's only becoming more mainstream, that the nature is the capital, which we need to exploit and have in a very different way. Unfortunately, I don't have a very positive picture there to paint, despite all the communities we work with and engage with, they have. So there's a whole clash of civilization, but also clash of worldview, and seems to be we are reaching a point of no return, where the chasm between two is only growing, there doesn't seem to be anywhere meeting. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Jayati, you made a point in your initial statement about the importance of knowledge. Maybe you could pick up on that.
Yes, thank you. And in fact, when Madhuresh was talking very correctly about how the privatization of nature has created all these new markets, I was thinking of the other kind of new market that has really emerged from really the 1990s onwards. And it's very much a function of the TRIPS agreement. the Trade-Related Intellectual Property Rights Agreement, and that is the market for knowledge and technologies. Increasingly, we have a reinforcement of very rigid rules that are partly in the US patent system and other very rigid systems, which lead to the concentration of knowledge, the codification of traditional knowledge, its appropriation by large corporations, and then the breaking up of various parts of knowledge into these. I noticed that we have very little time left, so let me just also add one point to the excellent points that Jens made about the need to rein in private large capital. It's not just about taxation, and taxation is essential, but I would argue that even the 15% minimum tax is not adequate. We had suggested 25%, which is the median of tax rates, corporate tax rates globally. Half of the countries in the world have tax rates higher than that. And that is really how we shouldn't be going with what the corporations persuaded the OECD to do as a compromise. We should actually be aiming for a higher minimum tax rate. But also, I think it's important to emphasize redistribution. Regulatory processes have dramatically increased the profit share of large companies. So well before you get into the taxation part, the reason they're able to have these very high profits is because we allow them to profiteer during periods of shortage or assumed shortage and scarcity. We allow them to repress workers' share and workers' wages. We allow them to grab rents in different ways. So I think we really have to think of a combination of regulation and taxation to rein in large capital and to make sure that these things, which are all ultimately produced by workers, the benefits of these come back to the workers and to society as a whole.
Jens, you will have the last word, but I would like to challenge you with two more questions. One that has been stated by Enzo Culasso in the public. He says, what do you think of the nature-related crimes like ecocide, and how would those be applied, those like prosecuted in the front with regard to multinational corporations? And I myself would like just to throw in one more aspect, which is really important to me. Do you think that at this time of the game, when we are trespassing planetary boundaries in so many dimensions, SDG Goal 8, which still encompasses economic growth, does make any sense? So I would like to thank everybody from right now to have attended this webinar. I would like to thank also the people who have followed us on Facebook or the people who will watch us on Facebook in the future. I would like to thank you three panelists for your very interesting insights, for sharing your experience and your rich trajectories on this topic. And I will hand over to Jens for the final remarks.
Oh, what an honor. Thank you. No, but I fully agree with what you said before on the problem of commodification of nature. But at the same time, I see a growing, emerging trend in discourse which deals with the right of nature. I mean, we had this in Ecuador and Bolivia when it was included in the constitution there, the rights of nature, rights of Mother Earth. But we have it now in many countries, including Germany, for instance, a discussion, a movement of civil society groups fighting for the rights of nature, having a discussion that nature should have additional rights. And that is also related then to natural crimes or crimes against nature. If nature is a subject by law, so to speak, then we can have better instruments to protect nature. And that's something I think which is a kind of positive, optimistic trend. At the same time, I see that we have still the discussion we had years before. Jayati mentioned Stieglitz, and there was another commission, Stieglitz-Sen Commission, on alternative measures progress and well-being. So we have to think about alternative measures, alternatives to GDP, and that's something we have at the global level, the discussion about alternatives to just economic indicators for well-being. And that's, in my view, also essential when we want to change the discourse, when we want to go beyond this economy-driven narrative and other forms of indicators of well-being beyond GDP are really essential in this regard. And in the next 1 or 2 years, there will be a discussion at the UN level on this, and I think we should all try to influence this discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and have a good day, have a good night, depending on where you are, and do not forget to attend the next webinars organized by the Institute for Policy Studies and the Pacto Ecosocial del Sur. Take care.